Welcome to Chapter 15, IT Security Controls, Plans, and Procedures. It's very common when people think of computer security and network security to leap to the technology and principle aspect of things, and we've covered a lot of that in the earlier portion of this course. But as we wind things up and get into the last couple of chapters, I think it's important that we put a little bit of time and effort into focusing on things other than crypto and firewalls, intrusion detection, penetration testing, and things like that, and think a little bit more about the management and some of the core principles that help to secure the networks that have nothing to do with the technical aspect of network and computer management. So this chapter is going to take a long look at some of those principles. I think it's going to be an interesting look at the merging of technology and policy. That's a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. It's going to include IT security management and implementation, some of the things that go along with a good implementation of a management strategy. Some talk about specific types of controls or safeguards that can be used to better secure the site. IT security plans and what they look like a little bit, breaking them down into the minutia of everything that makes them up. And of course, looking at the implementation of that plan, as well as some of the awareness and training aspects that are necessary for the people that are involved. And then, of course, we're going to go into looking at the monitoring risks, things such as maintenance, security compliance, change and configuration management, and of course incident handling, culminating with a little bit of discussion about a case study for the Silver Stars mine. So to discuss IT security management, sometimes it's helpful to begin with a structured process. And if any of you have any intentions of working for the government or many of the regulated industries such as finance, insurance, investment, etc., you're going to need to get very in tune with two particular acronyms. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST as they're known, is a body that puts together a lot of best practices, maintains measurement standards, things of that nature, and they of course have weighed in on some of the best practices for IT security management, building a very structured process, which you see on the slide. A lot of this was in response to the FISMA Act, the Federal Information Security Management Act, which required a lot of the professionalization and documentation of processes in the field of IT security management due to a series of breaches that caused some concern about the credibility and the protection of the financial sector and some of those very important elements of our society that they felt needed to be looked at that time. So getting to know these, getting to understand this management process is a good beginning, and we're going to concentrate on step 2, which is looking at the specific controls involved. So one of the things you'll find in trying to work in any of these fields is that oftentimes definitions are very helpful in kind of getting onto the same page. One of the problems in IT security is commonly that controls, safeguards, countermeasures, all of those mean the same things and are used interchangeably. Things that basically help to reduce the risk, and that's okay and everything, but it does get confusing sometimes, especially if you're working across departmental or interagency environments, where the meaning of words can really matter in terms of funding, in terms of understanding, in terms of a lot of things. So always good to get onto the same page. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading that, but you can see some of the highlights of control or the actions that are taken to eliminate or prevent some of the security problems that are faced by an organization. So read that, know it, understand it, because that's an important element of understanding. So, of course, close on the heels of getting a single definition that we can all work off of and understand, it's human nature to want to put things into neat little boxes. And one of the things in the area of controls that is commonly done is to put things into various classes of control. You see the 3 prime ones here that people generally agree upon are the management controls, which refers to things that some of the senior leaders need to do in terms of of implementing policies that make sense and actually are effective in reducing things. There are, of course, operational controls that must be in place, so that in the daily operation of the business, some of the things that allow that work of the organization to get done need to happen in conjunction with the regular operating procedures of the organization. And then, of course, there are technical controls, things that you can do with the hardware, the software, use of firewalls, use of antivirus software, just basic things that can shore up a organization's network so it's not as vulnerable to attack or to exploitation or some of the things that can go on. Now, the danger in doing this, of course, is that you can oftentimes find these classes as not being really neat little boxes, and things oftentimes fit into one or more of the control class categories, which can sometimes start food fights over who has the control, especially when budgets are involved, who has responsibilities, especially when something goes wrong, i.e. the blame game. And so there are some problems with these classes, but generally speaking, it is a useful tool for trying to break things down and assign some lines of effort and lines of responsibility in an organization. One of the things that I've seen go bad in this particular area is a desire by management to maintain total control, rule with the iron fist, ignoring some of the operational implications of some of their actions. Prime example of this was when I was stationed in Pakistan. There were a lot of problems with concerns over use of digital senders. These are these things that are very handy for scanning documents and being able to email them back and forth and everything. But there also is some inherent risk in terms of classified information or sensitive information, perhaps being captured by someone if you're in a foreign country such as Pakistan or Afghanistan. The threat's always there, and so it could be somewhat disconcerting. And of course, people that are 3,000, 4,000, 9,000 miles away can come up with some really interesting ideas on how to control that information and make sure that never ever happens. Unfortunately, sometimes not realizing that the operational burdens that they're placing on people are just astronomical, and in all truth, sometimes not very feasible. So these are some of the challenges in getting the classes to work and play well together, but just one example that thought might be of interest to put that in context, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this in your own positions in various organizations. While by no means exhaustive, the table 15.1 that you see in front of you actually has a pretty good breakdown of a mix of management, operational, and technical classes of security controls, and sort of gives you a notional picture of how they kind of work together, sort of the mix between the different areas and everything. And you'll see that in a good organization, a strong organization, there's a lot of focus on operational controls, where the people doing the business actually are responsible for ensuring that security measures are properly followed, and that some of the planning and guidelines that management's put together, along with the technical security controls that have been put in place by the administrators, often work together to be pretty effective. And it just gives you a little bit of a notional breakdown of what the classes of security controls working together can look like in a typical organization. So, of course, it's important to flesh things out and get a little more detailed than just the three classes of controls. So if you look at 15.2 here on the screen, you'll see that there is considerable depth and distinction and clarification in terms of the terms that are being used and everything. Now, one thing to bear in mind in terms of any organization is that none of them have unlimited resources, and so, of course, getting the mix right and keeping it within the resource limitations of a given organization is a very important thing. The risk profile feeds into this, how those resources and capabilities can maybe be brought to bear. If you've got a very small staff, very low budget, then you're going to have less of an ability to put together a really concrete control plan that's going to be executable. And sometimes in smaller businesses especially, this becomes an issue because IT isn't the business. Thus the plethora of outsourcing opportunities in this area for organizations that maybe don't have the internal resources to execute on that. But this gives you a little bit of a list of some of the types of things that would be fleshed out in a formalized plan. So certainly in an ideal world, the risk treatments that you would execute would hopefully reduce the risk to zero, but in the real world, that's a very unlikely scenario, and so there's going to be some residual risk that the organization is going to need to deal with in some meaningful way. And sometimes you have more latitude on these things than others. Private companies certainly isn't bound by quite as many of the governmental requirements and things of that nature, but they may be guided by other legal requirements or liability requirements, things of that nature. So it's important to get a handle on just how much effectiveness you've gotten out of your treatment so that you know what residual risk you're dealing with and ensure that your organization is comfortable in assuming that level of risk. So managers lacking sufficient resources to actually implement all of the recommended security controls are faced with a pretty daunting challenge. How do they know what is the have to and what is the nice to of their organization? And cost-benefit analysis is a tool that's used for this quite often. But sometimes it's difficult to come up with estimated costs because sometimes they're very intangible. There's some things that can be measured very easily. Lots of facts, figures, statistics, things of that nature. But some are a little bit harder than others to capture, and so estimation of the cost can be quite difficult. One good example of this was something the Air Force was grappling with right before my retirement, where they were trying to balance how much security the network had with the ability for it to actually be worth something to someone and usable, because as online commerce and things of this nature have been put in place so that the Department of Defense can do a lot of its logistics and things of this nature in an online environment. A need is developed for them to have access to commercial systems and things of that nature. But all the while, the other side of the coin is that that is a network that is used to execute command and control operations and things of that nature. The very important business of the Air Force. And it can become quite tricky to affect that balance because if you don't purchase the goods and materials and the services, if you can't educate your force appropriately because some of the restrictions on distance learning environments violate network policy and protocol, you get into an interesting mix, and sometimes putting a dollar value on it or a value in terms of usability or things like that can be quite difficult. So cost-benefit analysis is a good tool, but it's not a panacea, and sometimes it bears further consideration as to what some of the hidden costs of some of the implementation of controls can bring to an organization. I'm going to let you in on a little bit of secret here, which probably isn't much of a secret to you, but management processes and controls and things of that nature sometimes aren't the most exciting things to talk about. So, in a real classroom, you oftentimes take a break, you stand up, you stretch, you do some things like that. So why not a virtual version of that? So just a little bit of a snippet from the internet of funny and stupid things that go on in our world that I thought might give you a little bit of a break in the action here before we get back into the IT security plan. So take a little break and enjoy. So what's in the security plan really isn't any kind of a mystery. Once a management team has put together a pretty good list of what kind of controls they want to implement and what they think the value of each is and everything, and they've done their due diligence on that, well, then it's just time to come up with a plan to implement that. And certainly some of the key elements of that is figuring out what's going to be done, the actions that are going to need to be taken. If it's a technical type of a control, then somebody's probably going to have to configure something differently in terms of potentially access control lists or things of that nature. What kind of resources are going to be required to actually make this thing happen? There may be additional software, hardware, training, things of that nature, and then of course who's responsible for it. In the case of technical controls, sometimes that's pretty straightforward. It's going to be the IT folks, but sometimes in the operational world, it's not necessarily so cut and dry. Because a lot of work units feel they're already taxed pretty heavily, and they don't think that the aspects of making things more secure in the information world are necessarily things that should fall to them, especially when they're not being given any more resources to do it. So this can be a complex answer or question to get the answer to, but overall it comes down to those three elements, and really getting them identified so that you can implement the control that you've chosen to go with. Obviously important, because if you get these things identified, well, then you can actually implement them in an effective way to improve the performance of the identified deficiencies in the risk profile that were initially identified. So distilling all that down into usable information, what you see before you is an implementation plan table, and you can see it addresses all of those type of things that we talked about. It identifies the level of risk as being high. It says who's going to be responsible. In this case, John Doe. John Doe's responsible for a lot of things, but you get the point. It gives the timing. It gives some of the resource requirements. A little bit about why some of the controls were picked, because they were low threat, low cost, and relatively easy to get to. So for the time of a little bit of system administration time, they're able to significantly improve the posture of the company and reduce some of that risk. So this is a visual of what that would look like in a actual security plan document. Now, one of the things that's often missed in implementation phase and everything, after all that information from that table has been put together, and the who, what, when, why, and how of it and everything, when it comes go time and you actually push that big go button in the sky to move forward with the implementation, oftentimes there's a lot of angst that was kind of hiding under the surface and everything about the changes, things going on with it. So it's very important for management to take a leadership role and make sure that people understand that they're going to get the appropriate training on the details. There should be some lead-up meetings that describe what's going to be going on, what it's going to look like, some of the resources that are going to be available to people, when they have questions and things of that nature. And that planning, that strategic communication is vital to the success of the implementation of any new control, because otherwise there's a good chance for failure. You see a lot of this going on here at Penn State with the conversion from Angel to Canvas for our LMS. Very, very assertive effort by the folks that are running this to make sure that the professors understand, the staff understand, the students understand all that there is to understand about what's involved with this transition process. Lots of training sessions, lots of updates in terms of status, things of that nature. And that's a sign of an organization that's fairly mature when they recognize those things, because oftentimes the fear of the unknown can be one of the greatest enemies to successful implementation. So something to keep in mind when you get out there and are an IT manager is to make sure that your people are informed, properly trained, and understand just exactly what's going on and why it's important. Another aspect that's often lost on management as a responsibility is some of the follow-up that's required after implementation has occurred. This isn't a fire and forget type of operation. That's a living, breathing system. Threats and vulnerabilities change over the course of time. Equipment gets upgraded, and at each step in this, it's important that there's a couple of things going on. That includes the maintenance of the security controls to make sure that they're current with the times. Some compliance checking to make sure that some of the operational things going on, that people are actually doing it and staying diligent about that and haven't maybe started to slack off, as is sometimes human nature. And of course, looking at some of the configuration management and change orders and some of the implications that come out of those. And then, of course, if the worst happens and there is an incident, there needs to be some type of a plan in place as far as what incident handling is going to look like. And these are all very important responsibilities in the follow-up of implementation that need to be addressed by management. Maintenance is probably one of the most important of the elements of something that needs to be kept up and addressed in terms of control reviews. Simply because the changing environment is so dynamic and things happen so quick. Things like the rise of China and Russia in terms of advanced persistent threats to our SCADA systems and things of that nature are just one of the many things that are out there. And so that changing environment makes it necessary to ensure that periodic reviews are built into the cycle and that upgrades are conducted in such a way as to meet the demands of that new requirement. We see Penn State actually moving forward on this a little bit with two-factor authentication becoming a requirement for access to many of the systems that maintain sensitive student data. Probably a direct result of the engineering hack and the liberal arts hack. Nobody knows all the details of that. Certainly you wouldn't want to broadcast them to the world, but any rational thinking person would probably consider that many of these moves to two-factor authentication, things like that, are definitely in response to new and changing threats out there. So maintenance is a very, very critical factor in this ongoing fight that we have to maintain security of our networks. Compliance checks are another very important element in terms of checking up on the controls and everything. As mentioned, human nature is to become somewhat lax if there aren't regular intervals where compliance is looked at and checked up on from time to time. In the military system, the Inspector General, IG, would oftentimes have this as a separate area entirely that looked in detail at the way that communications folks were administering the networks, conducting radio protocol checks, things of that nature. All with the full intention of making sure that the security plan was being followed and that those best practices and all that effort that went into coming up with a game plan to minimize the risk was actually being executed. Little things like checking to make sure people were properly marking external media, that they're using proper shredder techniques to destroy any kind of paper product that may have PII on it or things of that nature. Just a whole host of things like that. And then, of course, making sure that the IT folks are doing regular patches, things of that nature to make sure that everything's up to snuff on that. But definitely an important element to make sure that the compliance checks are being done periodically. Certainly at the outset of a new system, you would want to do something like that. But more importantly is the regular interval thing, because that stuff can get lost over time and sometimes vulnerabilities creep in. So that, in conjunction with maintenance, is really an effective tool for keeping things up to date. The third monitoring task that's very important is change in configuration management. Now, this will vary considerably depending on the criticality of the system. And sometimes, just going ahead and doing an upgrade and seeing what happens is, not catastrophic. If you have problems with a, word processor not doing something, well, maybe that's not such a big deal. But if you're talking about something like the command and control system for the nuclear enterprise, or if you're talking about the Air Operations Center for the United States Air Force, that they use to conduct all of their air operations worldwide. That can be a pretty big deal if a rogue driver causes problems and all of a sudden some system isn't able to communicate with the world, or if they're not able to run specific software or things of that nature. So depending on the criticality, this may or may not be a very formal enterprise that is undertaken. But it's very important to conduct an evaluation so that you know what the impacts are. Something that was a routine headache for the folks on the Air Force network at the base that I was at right before I retired was that a lot of the tools, things like administrative systems like LeaveWeb for people to put in their leave paperwork, or travel vouchers, things of that nature. When a Windows version would be upgraded, sometimes this would cause all sorts of headaches with that software, causing availability issues and a lot of lost productivity. So, certainly that's a negative element. But also with these things come, the potential for significant security holes. And so if you aren't looking at, what some of the identified things are, when you're doing a given upgrade to a particular operating system, or when you're looking at an operating system that you're running on that's very stable but is no longer going to be supported, such as the Windows XP system, well then you have a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. And so it's it's really important to keep detailed records on what hardware configurations you have, what software configurations, what device drivers you're running, the types of video cards, because all of this can come together to cause significant problems in terms of managing the enterprise and being productive and maintaining good security. The last area of importance in monitoring is the actual handling of an incident should it occur. This has many hallmarks of the plan itself, just basically the details of what's going to happen if a incident does occur. And this is very important so that there's an organized approach and people are working off of the same sheet of music in terms of the actions that they're to take, to make sure that the user at the system level understands things that they need to do to ensure that they facilitate the orderly return to service of the network, if it has to be taken down or whatever may be occurring. Some of the things that are a hallmark of any good incident handling plan are obviously having that organized approach, but then too also having a means of assessing just how much damage or compromise has occurred, because sometimes that's not as straightforward and as easy a question to answer as one might think. Also having a detailed set of processes so that that when an incident occurs, what you're needing to do to recover from that. And obviously you want to limit the amount of time that you're down, that you're out of service, that you're compromised in terms of your ability to do your day in, day out mission. And so it becomes very important to have a means that you can move forward with that'll limit that damage, that'll minimize the recovery time, and assess costs and try to keep them to a bare minimum as well. And finally, once this has happened, in the aftermath, having gathered all that data, it's very important to do an after-action report that actually assesses what happened, gets all the details documented, and then recommends some fix actions to assure that this isn't something that will repeat itself. So incident handling, very important. A lot of organizations have a very specific set of folks that actually deal with this. The CERT, as it's sometimes called, the Computer Emergency Response Team, is oftentimes the first on scene, if you will, or the first responders for these types of incidents, and they're the ones with the training and the expertise to know what needs to be done to minimize the impacts. So having discussed management controls and technical controls and operational controls a little bit and understanding a little bit more about them, sometimes it's best if you can actually point that at some sort of a scenario to get the most out of the learning experience. So what I'm asking you to do is go back to Chapter 14 and read up on the Silver Star Mine case study. And when you're reading through that, think about the Given that you're given a risk assessment and it has some of the problems associated with the Silver Star mines, be thinking about some of the possible controls that you could see that might be put into place that would actually be beneficial. And basically what's going to happen then, we're going to have a discussion question that is going to explore this a little bit more detail. There'll be some questions posed to you that you should be prepared to offer some insights and try to bring the bulk of what we've talked about within this chapter to bear on that, so that you can put forth some good recommendations for some controls that might be implemented in that. So wrapping things up on our discussion of IT security controls, plans, and procedures, just to summarize a little bit about what we talked about, we touched on some of the security management implementation aspects, touched on some of the controls or safeguards. I think the three basic category areas of management controls, operational controls, and technical controls. Talked a little bit about an IT security plan and what that entailed and what it looked like. And then the implementation process, how you actually put these actions into words and deeds and actually implement them to see if you can improve on the security situation that exists, minimize some of the exposure, things of that nature. And then, of course, highlighting the importance of making sure that that plan's communicated and that there's good awareness and training for the folks that are going to have to carry it out day in, day out. Also talked a little bit about some of the monitoring factors that need to take place after the implementation goes into effect. It's not a stagnant environment, so it's very important to conduct regular maintenance actions to explore whether anything has changed in your environment. Certainly some security compliance checks on some kind of a cyclical basis are a best practice to be followed. Configuration and change management, a vital part in conjunction with the maintenance to make sure that you're keeping your controls up to date with the current environment and that things don't slip out of currency on you without you regularly reviewing them. And then, of course, should all else fail, how do you deal with an incident and how do you get things back on track and minimize the damage that takes place along the way. Look forward to having a discussion with you about the case study and the Silver Star mines. Offers a good opportunity for us to further explore some of these controls and how they can be used to make your organizations